Hey guys, I am super excited to bring you this build. And for so many reasons. It melts bosses. It's a fast mapper. It's not that expensive. It's a one button build. I'd have to say, of all the builds I've played, including the Bladefall Blade Blast build that I made a few leagues ago, this is the best build by far. To be clear though, I did not create the concept for this build. I knew I wanted to play an Eye of Winter build, so I did some digging around on PoE Ninja, and I found that there was a Poet's Pen cast on crit Eye of Winter build that was being played almost exclusively by Korean players. I don't think I found a single Western player who was playing the build. So I'm assuming it's quite possible that a Korean Twitch streamer or YouTuber possibly created this build, and I just wasn't able to find the source material. So if anyone who's watching this video does know who originated this build, please let me know. I'd love to credit them in the description and in the comments. That being said, I did make a few tweaks to the build that kind of suited my play style and that I think kind of gave a benefit to the build overall. So I'll kind of go over that as I discuss the different aspects. So the first thing I want to talk about is the core concept of this build. There's three things that we're trying to do with this build. The first is using a Poet's Pen to apply brittle, which then scales our base crit and enables our 6-link cast on crit setup in our chest. The second thing is we're trying to chain projectiles off of Hydrosphere to gain massive added chaos damage from Gloomfang. And then third, we're using the abhorrent Interrogation gloves in order to scale both our cold and chaos damage for big damage. So that's the core concept of the build, and all of the items in the build and the skill gems and the passive tree are all set up around enabling those three things. So the next thing I'm going to go over is sort of the core items of the build. So the most important item in this build is the Interrogation Small Cluster Jewel, which adds Secrets of Suffering. Now, if you've never seen this jewel before, it does a couple things. First, it actually disables your ability to ignite, chill, freeze, or shock. So there won't be any of that in this build, except for one exception, which I will touch on when we go over the gems. What it does enable is for our critical strikes to inflict Scorch, Brittle, and Sap. As you can see in the description here, Scorched enemies have their elemental resistances lowered by up to 30% based on the fire damage of the hit. So this is the one that replaces our Ignite. Hits have up to plus 15% critical strike chance against brittle enemies based on the cold damage of the hit, which inflicted brittle for 4 seconds. So that's what's replacing our chill and freeze. And then finally, sapped enemies deal up to 20% less damage based on the lightning damage of the hit for 4 seconds. That is replacing shock in this build. And I want to be clear, as you probably may have noticed from the montage video at the beginning, even against Shaper and enemies that have higher ailment thresholds, we're still hitting the cap for each of these. So this is the most important element of the build because this allows us to cap our crit, this reduces the damage that enemies deal to us, and it massively reduces their elemental resistances. The second key item is a Poet's Pen. So normally we're sitting at around like a 20% or 30% base critical strike chance. As you can see here, it's 16.79%. So the way that we get that to 100% is by applying brittle. And with such a low crit chance, we can't rely on our cast on critical strike setup to apply that initial brittle. So the point of the Poet's Pen is to socket it with an Eye of Winter, Inspiration Support, and an Awaken added cold damage, so that when we attack with our Power Siphon and we trigger the skill that is inside of Poet's Pen, which is Eye of Winter, it hits the enemy and it begins to apply that brittle, increasing our cast on critical strike and then enabling our cast on critical strike setup from the body armor to work. So Poet's Pen is kind of this ramping device that gets us to the 100% critical strike chance without really having to invest in it anywhere else. The third most important item is Gloomfang. And Gloomfang does a couple things for us. The first is it allows skills to chain one time. Now, the critical part about this is when you have Hydrosphere out, the projectiles that you see, or I should say the shards that you see spiraling out from the Eye of Winter projectile, they can actually chain off of this Hydrosphere. Once they've chained, they gain the second benefit of Gloomfang, which is 42% of non-chaos damage is extra chaos damage, which is just a massive amount of chaos damage. We also get the benefit of some chaos damage leashed as life from that added chaos damage, additional projectile speed, and we also get mana regeneration, which is actually pretty important for this build. The next most important item is the Abhorrent Interrogation Gloves. These gloves are pretty critical to the build. So while, as you can see from reading the gloves, we basically lose our ability to penetrate or ignore elemental resistances, meaning that cold penetration support, the boot enchant for cold penetration or penetration of elemental resistances if you haven't killed recently, none of that stuff will function on this build. But what this build does allow us to do is to inflict Withered, have a 23% chance to inflict Withered for 2 seconds on hit. Now, as you probably saw from the montage video, in combination with Sniper's Mark, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of projectiles flying out. So practically speaking, we will be reaching the 15 Wither stack cap on virtually every tanky mob and every boss that we fight. And the benefit of these gloves is that each of those stacks increases the elemental damage taken on enemies from hits by 4%. And the other important aspect is that Withered doesn't lose its intrinsic benefit of increasing the chaos damage that enemies take. So not only does inflicting a stack of Withered now increase our elemental damage from our hits, but it's still increasing our chaos damage from our hits. And remember, we're getting a massive amount of chaos damage from our Gloomfang. So it kind of is like a double dipping that we get in the build by using these gloves. The next important item is this Lighter Lunaris Spirit Shield. So when you look at this Spirit Shield, the most important is the last 2 lines here, which apply to the critical strike multiplier. Effectively, because we end up being attack block capped with glancing blows, and because we sort of have this oscillating crit, non-crit aspect with brittle, this shield should really read plus 100% to critical strike multiplier, because effectively that's what we're getting with the way the build functions. We also get flat cold damage. We get additional chance to block, increased critical strike chance for spells, and if you get a nice corruption like this one, you can actually stretch the energy shield up quite a bit. I think you can get it just over 300 if you have a really high roll on the increased energy shield, because the base damage adds so much to this. The next thing that's critical to this build is a Watcher's Eye with life gained for each enemy hit while affected by Vitality. Ideally, you would want to get a perfect rolled Gloomfang, so you're only losing 10 life for each enemy hit by your spells, and 20 life for each enemy hit by your attacks. So if you're gaining 30 life on your life gain on hit because of your Watcher's Eye, and you're losing 30 life on your Gloomfang, they're canceling each other out, and we wind up at sort of a net neutral. So we basically take away the downside of Gloomfang. If you want to be even better, or if you can't quite find a perfectly rolled Gloomfang, you can also get a mod like this on your ring that gives you additional life gain for each enemy hit by your attacks. So the idea here is to either be neutral on the amount of life you gain and lose on hit, or come out slightly ahead. In my case, I gain 17 life for each enemy hit by my attacks once I subtract this extra point that I'm losing here because it rolled 21 instead of 20. The next important thing is that you want 2 rings with -8 to total mana cost. Now, effectively what this does, if we look at our tooltip, is that it makes the Poet's Pen Eye of Winter cost nothing, and it makes our Cast on Crit Eye of Winter cost 2 mana. Now, you don't actually want to bring your mana down to 0 for this, because you need to spend at least some mana to trigger the inspiration charges from inspiration support. So you want to make sure, and it really is critical, that at least one of your Eye of Winters, it will probably be the 6-link one because the extra supports increase the mana multiplier, but you want to make sure it's dealing at least 1 damage so you can generate those inspiration charges. The next sort of 2 critical items in this build are these 2 large cluster jewels. Essence Rush basically enables us to leech energy shield, and it also gives us increased damage. Conjured Wall effectively brings us very close to the block cap. You could reskill a couple things and get to 75% chance to block spell damage. I'm sitting at 72% chance right now with Conjured Wall. But the idea is that if you put Vortex on your movement basically your movement slot on your skill bar, it will automatically cast, and it will trigger the benefit of Conjured Wall, which is an additional 6% chance to block spell damage if you've cast a spell recently. And because this is a glancing blows build, effectively that becomes 12%. It gets doubled. So that's the benefit of this cluster jewel here. The second cluster jewel, we really want Inspired Oppression, Doryani's Lesson, and Prismatic Heart. The build is a little bit starved for elemental resistances because of the high numbers of uniques that are in the build. And on top of that, even though one of our Iron Winters costs no mana, our Vortex still costs 8 mana, and one of our Eye of Winter still costs 2 mana, and the Spellslinger setup, as far as Sniper's Mark goes, I believe also costs 8 mana. So we still have some skills that we're triggering that is going to cost mana within this build. So having this extra mana regeneration from Inspired Oppression is really important. And it also gives us 10% increased effect of non-damaging ailments, which is pretty critical to being able to scale up our Scorch, Brittle, and Sap to the max amounts that are allowable. The Doryani's Lesson gives us Life Leech, and as I'll explain with Petrified Blood, that essentially means that we have over-leech. And then Prismatic Heart gives us the extra elemental resistances and the 30% increased elemental damage. The next really critical thing in this build is a Blizzard Crown that is crafted with a Deafening Essence of Loathing, which gives you the 10% increased mana reservation efficiency of skills. This is critical to be able to enable all the auras in this build. And as long as you have around 40 to 50 unreserved mana, you'll be very comfortable and you won't experience any situations where you're out of mana and you can't trigger your skills. And then finally, the last most important item is a Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel, sacrificed in the name of Doryani. And basically what this is going to give us is this keystone here for Corrupted Soul. So we're going to gain 15% of our max life as extra maximum energy shield. And as you can see, it's over 1,000 ES that is gained by having this jewel. Some things to consider when you purchase one is how these nodes change. Ideally, maybe you would want some ES, max life, chaos resistance. If you could get increased cold damage and cold damage leeches life, that would be good. Increased effective curses, extra resistances. There's a lot of good things that you can get here. Increased critical strike chance. So I'd recommend rolling a few until you sort of see these notables change in a way that is beneficial to the build. Next thing I want to talk about is sort of the core gems of the build, then the skill tree, and then kind of the upgrades that you can do in this build. And just before I move on to that, I do want to quickly point out the flasks in this build, and especially this one, the Elixir of the Unbroken Circle. I think this is a highly underrated flask. I think it's incredibly cheap, like 15C for the benefits that it gives you. And basically what this flask is doing is it's giving a life-based Ghost Shroud for free to the build. So if you look at Ghost Shroud, you basically gain up to 3 Ghost Shrouds, and every time you're hit, you lose a Shroud and you recover energy shield equal to 3% of your evasion rating. Now, what Elixir of the Unbroken Circle does is something sort of similar. When you activate the flask, you begin gaining endurance charges every second up to a max of 3. Then, when you trigger the flask again, you recover 4% of life per each endurance charge, but you lose all the endurance charges. So effectively, it's kind of like a life-based Ghost Shroud. You gain these things on your character, and then when another triggering event happens, you lose them and they restore EHP. This is really good. If you basically instill it with use when charges reach full, it kind of is constantly triggering. So you're constantly gaining and losing endurance charges. So you either have one of two things. Either you have extra physical damage reduction from the endurance charges when they're up, and then when the flask reaches full and triggers, you gain a bunch of life back. You could be creative with this. You could also put on the flask things like used when you take a savage hit. So if you use the flask and gain the endurance charges, if you take a really big hit, it will then trigger the flask. It will heal you for 12%, and you'll basically start and begin to gain endurance charges during the effect of the flask again. So it creates this really nice cycle of a life-based Ghost Shroud. It's really good for the build. I also recommend a flask that I think is very underrated, which is an Atziri's Promise flask with 70% increased effect. This basically gives you, 14% of elemental damage as extra chaos damage, and that increase effect also scales the chaos resistance you gain. So it also gives you an incredible amount of chaos resistance for free. So moving on to the core gems of the build. So in our Poet's Pen, we have a Eye of Winter, level 21, with and really I bought a Divergent Inspiration support because I thought it would be good for this build. Ended up not really working how I wanted it to, so you could ignore the fact that this gem is Divergent. You really just need a regular Inspiration support, and then Awakened added cold damage support. And of course, again, this is going to be the Eye of Winter that sort of triggers those brittle stacks to start. Then in our body armor, we have Power Siphon, which is basically going to give us Culling Strike for free, and it's going to give us a very easy way to generate power charges and have those up at all times. We have Cast on Critical Strike support, regular Inspiration support. Do not use Divergent Inspiration support because the alternate quality will reduce the mana cost to 0, which we don't want because we won't gain Inspiration charges. A level 21 Eye of Winter, faster attack support, and Awaken added cold damage support. Now, I think a lot of people might question putting faster attack support in here. Of all the people I saw who were playing this build, faster attacks was, I think, like a 70% use rate. If you throw different gems into POB, some of them do more damage, but you have to consider that the way the build functions is we're essentially ramping up our Scorched and Brittle in tandem. As we lower the enemy resistances, our cold damage hits do more damage, and we're ramping up our Brittle. So really the idea is you almost kind of like a poison build. You want to get out as many attacks as possible so you can ramp up and reach the cap for each ailment. So while some things might do more damage, they don't get us to the point of doing the most damage as quickly as faster attacks does. And then finally, Awakened added cold damage support. In the helmet, we have our Spellslinger setup, and that's going to have Hydrosphere. As I explained earlier, the projectiles can chain off of Hydrosphere, causing them to gain extra damage from Gloomfang. And the important thing to understand is that essentially you want to stand and cast Hydrosphere behind the enemy. So if Keurig is a boss, we want the Hydrosphere to be about this far from the boss, because if you read the Eye of Winter ability, it basically says that projectiles gain damage as they travel. So you don't want to place the Hydrosphere right on top of the individual. You kind of want to put it behind them so that the projectiles chain back into them. And the reason we put it behind is because when I go over our medium cluster jewels, you want to be fairly close to the boss so that you can trigger your nearby effects. So you can't really put it in front of you or between you. It really has to go behind. And as you will see in gameplay, the larger swirling projectile that travels can just pass right through the boss. So there's no worry about collision. It will still reach the Hydrosphere behind the boss, and the projectiles will chain back. So kind of train yourself to place your cursor behind your target instead of on top of or in front of the target. The Divergent Fireball is very important in this build. Now, surprisingly, even though the Fireball does not have any support links here, we can still inflict a 30% Scorch on the enemy with just Divergent Fireball, because the alt quality here is 60% increased effect of non-damaging ailments on enemies. We don't care about the less damage with Ignite because we cannot Ignite in this build because of the Interrogation. And coupled with this critical mastery, where we do 50% increased effect of non-damaging ailments we inflict with critical strikes, we're getting 110% increased, plus another 10% from Inspired Oppression. So we're at a huge amount of increased ailment effect, which means that we're basically always reaching that Brittle and Scorched cap. And then finally, Sniper's Mark. This kind of goes without saying. Eye of Winter shards are projectiles. It's 40% increased damage from projectile hits. And it also causes projectiles to split, which can then hit other enemies and increases our clear. So overall, Sniper's Mark is a no-brainer here. In the shield, we have Vortex with Bone Chill and Divergent Arcane Surge support. Now, I know I said earlier that this build cannot chill and it cannot freeze because of the Secrets of Suffering. While that is true, my understanding, and I have tested this in game, is that the vortex effect that is left on the ground is actually considered a chilling area and is not considered to be you. And so the chill that is inflicted by vortexes lingering uh, by its sort of lingering swirl here, that can chill. And I've gone into maps and tested it. You can test it by going in, place a vortex down on a mob, and you will see that it hits anywhere between 15 to 20% chill on the enemy. So with bone chill, enemies in chilling areas have increased cold damage taken. So we're further increasing the cold damage that enemies take by around 15 to 20%. So do use bone chill. It does work. And then Divergent Arcane Surge support basically causes Arcane Surge to last longer. So if you level it up to around level 8 and you're kind of walking around and constantly casting your Vortex, you'll see Arcane Surge triggers at the top. And then by the time that it runs down to 0 seconds, you'll see that another one starts. So the Divergent Arcane Surge support basically allows us to level up the gem a little bit, get a bit more spell damage out of it, and still keep it with 100% uptime in the build. In our boots, we have cast when damage taken, Immortal Call, and Anomalous Tempest Shield. Now, the reason for Anomalous Tempest Shield is sort of two things. One, the skill itself, of course, gives us a massive amount of spell damage block, which is then doubled by Glancing Blows. But the real benefit is, as you can see, it does a massive amount of base lightning damage. And it is enough base lightning damage to inflict a 20% sapped on enemies when we block them. So when an enemy hits us with our high block chance, if we block, then the shield will basically send out kind of like an arc lightning. It looks actually kind of similar to Orb of Storm's chains or arc chains. And it will send that out and it will basically inflict a 20% sap. Now, the reason you want anomalous is because it adds an additional 2 chains. So instead of just inflicting a sap on maybe one enemy, we're ensuring that we're inflicting it on multiple enemies, and we have a better chance of inflicting it on rares or other enemies that may not have been the source of the hit, but that we still want to reduce the damage of. And then if you choose to go the Petrified Blood route, which I have, then you're going to want to use Anomalous Arrogant Support. The reason for this is that it has an additional 4% increased life reservation efficiency, which, as you can see here, means that our Tempest Shield will only reserve 48% of our life. Now, in case you don't know this, if you read Petrified Blood basically means that we cannot recover life above low life, which is 50%. So if you have a gap between your reserved life and that 50% cap, which we do, it's about 1.6 something percent difference, then that means that our life is never considered full, and any leech effects that we have will never expire. So we effectively have 4 seconds of over-leech that will occur after we gain any leech stacks. So if you're going to go this route, get the Anomalous Arrogance support because it's basically going to enable that over-leech. Petrified Blood, it basically enables us to take Pain Attunement for 30% more spell damage, although I would really only recommend it once you have around 5k life. Because if you're not aware of this, the way Petrified Blood works is it basically reduces your effective HP against one-shots. To give you an example, say you have a character with 1,001 health and you take 1,000 damage, you will live with 1 health. Well, with the way Petrified Blood works, if you equip Petrified Blood, you'll have half of your effective life, which is 500. So if you took a 1,000 damage hit, only 40% of that hit would be delayed, which means you would take 600 damage, and because you have 500 life, you would be dead. The 600 damage would exceed your 500 life, and you would instantly die. So it reduces your ability to take one shot. So I wouldn't recommend it until you kind of get a sufficient enough life pool where that isn't a problem. Then a level 21 precision. The build does have trouble getting accuracy rating, so you really do need to get the precision to level 21. Flame Dash, and then a level 1 Vitality. Vitality is not in this build for the life regen. We have plenty from life gain on hit, plenty from life leech. The benefit of putting this here at level 1 is to enable that Watcher's Eye with the 30 life gain on hit. So don't level it up. It's completely unnecessary. So that's pretty much all the gems in the build and the functions that each of the gems have. Now, to kind of just briefly go over the rest of the items that I don't really consider core items, but are things that you probably are going to want to get. Um, a Blizzard Crown with this enchant is very nice. The 12% increased frequency of Eye of Winter projectiles. And what I would basically say when you're picking up rares for this build is you want to try to get each rare with one high level resistance and some dexterity. You need 155 dexterity for Sniper's Mark, which is quite a lot. We don't path really through any dexterity nodes, so you have to supplement that with gear or picking up plus 30 dexterity nodes on the tree until you get gear with dexterity. And then because we pick up Prismatic Heart and we also pick up Holy Dominion, we are getting some elemental resistances from the tree. But if you at least focus on each rare having one good, strong T1 or T2 resistance on it, you will basically end up resistance capped. So just keep the dexterity and the resistance requirement in mind when you are purchasing rares. So on your ring, you're going to want a rare ring with a resistance, either strength or dexterity, and an open prefix for crafting. Non-channeling skills have minus to total mana cost. And then curse enemies with elemental weakness or frostbite on hit. You can use either. It's up to you. I do think elemental weakness on hit is better because it makes it easier to apply a more effective scorch and a more effective sap. But if you can't get one, that's okay. You'll still be able to cap your brittle with frostbite, and that's the most important one. The other ring is basically just life. Maybe if you can get something like accuracy on it or crit multi. But again, you need an open prefix for this non-channeling skills craft, and you want to make sure you get at least one big resistance. For the belt, this was the rare I decided to craft aspect of the spider on. You could do it on either of the rings. You can do it on the belt, and you just want to focus on getting a lot of life and a strong resistance. And then for the abyssal jewel, again, because we need accuracy so that we don't encounter a double crit check, I would recommend getting an abyss jewel with as much accuracy as you can get. They do go higher than this. I think they go up to 300 something on the accuracy, or nearly 300. And then a chance to gain phasing for 4 seconds on kill is really nice quality of life. And then for the boots, these cost me about 10 exalt. You could try to craft them yourself. I didn't want to do that. I had enough money. I just wanted to pay the money for it. For elusive on critical strike and tailwind, these are not in any way build enabling. I played the build for a long time before I got these boots. It just kind of give the boots that zoom factor that make it just feel faster in maps, make you feel quicker. The tailwind does give you some action speed, so you do attack a little quicker with it, but it's not build enabling. The chest, I would say, would probably be the first item I would get if I was trying to purchase my first really expensive item for the build. It enables us to apply an additional curse, which means you can then invest in some corrupted abhorrent interrogation gloves and get curse enemies with Enfeeble on hit. We also get attacks have plus base crit, which will help bring us to that 100% crit cap for attacks. We will already be crit capped for spells, so I wouldn't waste any time getting the mod spells have additional base critical strike chance, because that isn't an issue. But you will need the attack critical strike chance if you want to hit 100% with Power Siphon for triggering the Eye of Winter. And then, of course, 10% chance to gain a Frenzy Charge on hit, which gives us additional attack speed and more damage. So these are basically the rares in the build. For flasks, you have some options. If you haven't gotten the rings with the minus mana cost yet, I would recommend an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask of Occlusion. Basically, this just runs all the time. It hinders nearby enemies. You can also get a Sealing Flask, and that will basically prevent you from being inflicted with Corrupting Blood. So if you don't yet have a Corrupting Blood Jewel, an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask of Sealing is probably going to be the best. Then in terms of the other flasks, a Quicksilver Flask with movement speed, a Jade Flask with increased evasion rating, or when you pick up your chest, you end up with an Astral Plate or something armor based, then I would recommend probably switching this to a Granite Flask and just scaling up some of your armor. A sulfur flask with reduced effect of curses on you. Now, you want to get over 50% on this flask. The reason for that is that when you're on consecrated ground, curses have 50% reduced effect on you. And then with the craft, or sorry, with this particular roll on the flask being over 50%, that means you have 100% reduced effect of curses, which basically means that if you're on consecrated ground in a map, you're curse immune. So really good to have this specific roll on this flask. And then I already talked about the elixir and the promise. So turning quickly to the skill tree, as I'm sure this video is already getting long enough with enough information in it. Basically, what you want to pick up here in terms of jewels is an unnatural instinct. Again, it's not build enabling, but it just gives you so much stuff. It gives you accuracy, attack speed, spell damage, life, movement speed, projectile damage. It's just a really good location here. It gives a lot of benefits to this build. So if you can afford one, I would pick one up and put it there. When you're at the point that you're min-maxing the build, you can consider getting percent increased max life and then a combined 30% to critical strike multiplier jewels and fit those in. I would recommend a corrupted blood rare jewel. Try to get percent max life and then one other thing that's helpful for the build, either some attack speed, some resistances, global accuracy, crit multi, something that you need on the build. You know, try to get one as cheap as possible. Don't spend too much money on it, but maybe just look for one or two good mods. Then for the medium clusters, they're all the same. You want a 4 or 5 passive medium cluster jewel with eye to eye and repeater. So again, we're going to stand pretty close to the bosses. So these jewels end up being about 100% increased damage between these two notables, plus the attack speed. So they're really good. We've run 4 of them in the build. And then I would focus on either getting dexterity on that small passive or a little bit of maybe a resistance or that you're short to kind of make up for some, the fact that we have a lot of uniques in the build. In terms of the passive skill tree, I'm going to be putting a very detailed POB with this build. There is a note section. It outlines the core items you have to get for the build, kind of the extension items that kind of ramp up your survivability, your damage, but aren't critical to the function of the build. And then it will basically outline kind of the min-max items, the items that kind of give the build that feeling of zoom, like tailwind elusive boots, and for example, like a chance to deal triple damage Poet's Pen. And those are really the reach items. Those are the items you buy absolutely last when you are satisfied with the build, you enjoy playing it, and you really just want to min-max it. So in that detailed POB, there's multiple skill trees. And so there's basically 2 alternative level 98 skill trees. I didn't go to 100 because, practically speaking, a lot of people are not going to take their build to 100. So it's not too useful. But basically, you'll see from that POB that you can either kind of go more towards getting tankier with more life or picking up like another 200k worth of damage. So it really will be up to you what you want to do there. I went with the tankier route. So just kind of go over it. All right, we path down here for our natural instinct. We pick up the melding wheel to gain another 3% of max life as extra ES to go along with our glorious vanity jewel. We pick up pain attunement because we're low life with petrified blood. We path up here to basically socket in our cluster jewels. We get this critical mastery, which is critical for that increased effect of non-damaging ailments. Additional life and chaos resistance. The mana reservation efficiency wheel here with the mastery is critical to being able to reserve all the auras. We pick up some attack speed, accuracy, life, damage, and resistances. Additional life, glancing blows to basically bring us to capped attack block and nearly capped spell block. Once I get level 98, I'll probably pick up this small passive here, which will give me the extra points I need to be at 75. And then we path over here through these strength nodes to put in our other cluster jewels. You can also path up through the int nodes here, but if you're going to use petrified blood, you are going to need quite a bit of strength. As you can see from the gem, you need 159 strength. So for me, it was better to basically path through here and pick up an extra 30 strength to ensure that was being enabled. So the skill tree is really simple. It is a very tight skill tree. So my recommendation, because levels are so important to reaching all of these faraway points, is to maybe sacrifice a medium cluster jewel or two when you're earlier in your levels, or sort of between 85 and 94, to pick up some of these extra life nodes to increase your survivability, to ensure that you get those passive skill points that you need to really deck out the build. So that's pretty much the build. The build feels amazing. I have a friend who's running it with a headhunter. It's working very well with a headhunter. I never put headhunters in my builds because I feel like kind of makes the build disappear a little bit, and you end up not really playing the build. You're just playing headhunter. So I haven't incorporated a headhunter into my build, but you can if you have one and you would like to do that. I would recommend that you check out the path of building in the description, because it has a pretty detailed note section with tips and tricks. It kind of talks about maybe some issues that you might run into, that I ran into, and how I fixed them, and easy ways to deal with those problems until you kind of get the build to the point that you see with these items. And in the montage video, it goes over what some of the expected prices are for all of these items, so you kind of know what you're getting into before you do it. And it also has those alternative skill trees going up from basically level 80 all the way up every 5 levels to level 98, so that you can get a good idea of what's kind of important as you progress upwards. In terms of the ascendancy, my recommendation is that until you kind of start getting the very expensive items in the build, I actually recommend not taking Profane Bloom. The clear with this build is pretty good without it because of the chaining projectiles, and the fact that the cast on crit Eye of Winters will sometimes kind of split off and go in another direction, because they just go in the direction of wherever the Power Siphon crit. So because Power Siphon has quite a large fanning, you may get an Eye of Winter projectile that goes off to the side. So the clear is actually really good even without Profane Bloom. And that allows you to pick up Withering Presence, which gives you 15% more chaos damage. And between our Xeris Flask and Gloomfang, we're gaining more than 50% chaos damage from our cold damage, so it will scale that chaos damage. And then again, Inflicting Withered actually increases our elemental damage because of our gloves. So the ability to inflict Withered every second is actually quite good on this build. Now, the reason I recommend going Profane Bloom later is because once you have just an ungodly amount of damage in the build, Withering Presence is kind of useless. 15% more chaos damage is still really strong, but inflicting Withered on nearby enemies every second is kind of bad, because everything dies in less than 2 seconds. So practically speaking, this Ascendancy point is only going to inflict 1 or 2 Withered stacks. You're going to be applying the majority of your Withered stacks through the gloves. So I think at that point, that's kind of a dead affix on this Ascendancy point, and I would just recommend going Profane Bloom. You gain hexproof. You have the ability to apply hexes to hexproof enemies. And the explosions and really dense, meaty content that you're going to be doing with a min-max build, like 100% Delirium, or Triple Beyond, or Nemesis farming. The Profane Bloom is going to help a little bit better in those dense packs. But until you get to that point, the build doesn't scale any AoE, and so the Profane Bloom actually isn't that good. So it's really more of something you spec into an endgame when you have enough damage and you're doing really juiced content. And then the rest are kind of no-brainers. Void Beacon double dips because we do a lot of chaos and cold damage. So we're getting minus res to each of those. Frigid Wake is amazing. Can't be frozen, can't be chilled. Again, we chill enemies with our Vortex, so we have the ability for them to get freezed by this. Malediction lets us apply additional curse and get 15% increased effect of curses. It is really good. Now, in terms of the corruption on your gloves, I go with Enfeeble. I would not go with Temp Chains. The reason for that is because Temp Chains and Aspect of the Spider actually do not stack. Aspect of the Spider basically inflicts a hinder, and enemies who are hindered, if the Temp Chains movement speed reduction exceeds the hinder effect, they don't stack. It doesn't increase it in any way. So Temp Chains is really not very good if you're running Aspect of the Spider. I would recommend Enfeeble. Enfeeble is really great for Scourge because it reduces the amount of damage that monsters can do to us. It's very safe. For the anointment on the amulet, my recommendation is until you get this chest, you should anoint Whispers of Doom for +1 curse, because that will allow you to pick up a defensive curse like Enfeeble. Because we need to have 3 available to us, 1 for Sniper's Mark, 1 for Elemental Weakness, and 1 for Enfeeble. So I would anoint Whispers of Doom until you can afford a chest like this that gives you an additional curse. And afterwards, you kind of have to assess where your build is at. If you're still not accuracy capped, if you're around 95 or 97% chance to hit, then I would recommend this anointment because you get a lot of attack speed and you also get a bunch of increased accuracy ratings. So that would probably be my recommendation. Other options are an additional frenzy charge or throat seeker to give you more crit multi. Excuse me, or even wand slinger, which is just 30% increased damage while wielding a wand. So it will apply to your spells, and 10% increased attack speed with wands is also very good. So those are kind of some of your options there. So that's the build. I recommend checking out the POB. It's very detailed. You can always message me in game if you have any questions. Or what I would personally prefer is you drop a comment on YouTube, because then when I respond to it, other people can have the benefit of the answer if they had a similar question to you. Whereas if you message me in game and I answer your question, it's really only a benefit between the person who messaged me, and that's it. So thank you for watching. I hope you do try this build. I think it's amazing. It is, as you will see from the POB, it is actually a very cheap build to start. No one is playing this build. No other build is really using these items. Gloomfang is like 1 chaos. The gloves are 20C. Poet's Pens without the corruption are like 12 chaos. The jingling spirit shield is 15, 25C. The elixir flask and the Azeri's flask are like 5 to 15C. So, the interrogation jewel is something like, 20 or 30C. Even Doriani's are down to 40C right now. The medium cluster jewels are only about 50 chaos a piece. And even the large cluster jewels, you can get them for under an exalt, which if you're comparing it to other high-end builds that can do the kind of damage this build can do, that's basically a nothing budget for what this build can output. If you're looking for something that can do all content on a budget, this is a great build to do it, because the core items are cheap. And even on just those cheap core items, the build can do all the content and feel comfy. And then if you want to put more money into it, you can get to a point where it's just melting everything, and it's frankly a little ridiculous. So thanks again for watching. Check out the POB, and if you do decide to play the build, I hope you enjoy it.